Okay, well, can I just begin by just acknowledging the incredible effort that you, Dee and Michelle have done in putting all this together, and I'm sure everyone is just benefiting from the focus that you brought and that opportunity to kind of like share. Thank you for your very positive introduction. Can hardly wait to hear myself speak after all of that, so it's good. Now, I am a total, when it comes to technology, absolutely useless. So let's just see if we can bring this up and we can see.
It's happening. Yes. All right. I'm going on mute. It's all yours, Peter.
Right. Can people see that?
Yep.
Because I can't. All I've got is, again, the Zoom thing.
Strange.
And I'm just trying to find. Hang on.
You can just go, if you just go to your presentation, Peter, if you click along that link, then should be able to see it.
Yeah, but I cannot seem to move the. Let's just see if it'll actually move. Yep. Can people see that?
Yep.
Okay. Well, can I also also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, and particularly where I am based here in Kalamunda. That's the traditional owners of the land of the Wodja people of the Noongar Nation, and particularly just want to acknowledge their connection to land, water and community here, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and particularly in terms of the future. I acknowledge across the country we have this amazing mosaic of tribes and nations, and particularly just want to acknowledge any Indigenous people who are here tonight. I just want to thank you for your amazing stewardship of this continent for up to 70,000 years. My family have just over a 100-year connection to this continent, and I have friends in the territory who can claim close to a 70,000-year connection, and I think that puts it into context. I just want to always use every meeting to just acknowledge my thanks for the amazing stewardship that you've actually given. I'm also very conscious that tonight we are running workshops in the context of this thing called COVID-19, something that none of us wanted, something that none of us saw coming, something that none of us kind of like know is actually going to end. We know there's a tunnel, we know there's light at the end of that tunnel, but there are so many unknowns to it. And certainly it's brought consequences to all of us and to each of us here tonight, whichever country we're actually in. And really it is an opportunity to begin to think post COVID-19. And I suppose that's really what I just want to raise is simply, it is a time of incredible disaster. We've seen massive kind of implications in terms of health and mental health, and particularly unemployment and financial stress and anxieties and fears and everything associated with this thing. It's not like an earthquake. It's not like a cyclone. It's not like a bushfire that kind of like comes and you see the impact and then you can get on in terms of recovering. This is something we can't see, and it's something we don't know is when it's going to end. And it's caused huge uncertainty in terms of how we actually function. But it is also a time of opportunity, a time of reflection. And it really is a time to think post-COVID-19 and what is it that we particularly want to see happen. Without doubt, the evidence shows that there is still huge fear, still huge anxiety in terms of where people are actually at with it. And I'm sure all of us can relate to this particular lovely bit of art. It is a time that's actually changed the way that we work, how we operate, how our homes are starting to kind of like function and so on. I also think it's been a time of incredible humour. And I just had a friend in Tassie send me this. This is what their next door neighbour, you know, when this is all over, which meeting do I attend? Weight Watchers or AA? And I think, again, we need to kind of like bring out the humour at this time. One thing I particularly learnt from working over the last decade in the post-Christchurch earthquakes is the role that humour has played in helping people to cope. And I think we should be kind of like trying to popularise it as much as we can. Without doubt, to me, I think the real implications has been not just the health implications, but particularly the impact it's had on the economy and particularly on the loss of job and employment, and how that's just created a whole new set of kind of like worries and implications and stresses for people. And particularly for that 18 to 24-year-old group, who I think always takes the brunt when we are hit with with times of unemployment. And to me this morning, just reading a report that just showed that for many 18 to 24-year-olds, what we're going through now will actually have major implications for the rest of their working lives. I think there's going to be long-term implications. Here in Australia, we've already seen 1.6 million people unemployed. I think one of the critical things we've also seen is the fact that for many people, they were given 0 or 1 day in terms of losing their employment. And you can imagine the impact that that's actually had on the lives of many people and on the families of many people. To me, it's also been a time that's really demonstrated that one thing that actually has worked in all of this has been social solidarity. It's the way that people have actually started to come together. And I'm sure all of us have stories that we can resonate with. You know, the Captain Tom there in the UK, and the 99-year-old who decides to walk around his garden 100 times before he turns 100 to just raise money for the National Health Service, and in the process generates over $60 million. I mean, just amazing. Or kind of like this guy, Mark in Seattle, who is an unemployed opera singer now, who wheels out the PA system every afternoon at 5 o'clock and sings to his neighbours. And on average, 300 to 500 people turn up for an afternoon concert in the street. I just love how all that stuff has actually been happening. The way that kind of like neighbourhood pantries have happened, the friendly postcards. And to me, one of my favourite is one of the communities I'm working with currently, Dean's Marsh there in Victoria. Their neighbourhood house has just created this amazing kind of like grow-free pantry. And across the globe, we've just seen the most remarkable set of kind of like initiatives that have been kind of like happening. And to me, that's one of the great things that's actually come out of all of this. The way that mutual aid groups have sprung up in streets and neighbourhoods, and just the sheer number of people. And the number of people that have commented to me, you know, I've never had more conversations with neighbours as we're actually happening now. I had a guy say to me this morning, I've talked to more neighbours in the last 2 months than I've talked to him in the last 2 years. And, you know, that's good. That's great. And to me, the issue is, how do we keep this going? How do we make sure this becomes part of the new norm that we are kind of like seeking to kind of like create? To me, I love this post that came from Angie in Munford that simply said, have you realised it yet that no one is missing the material things? All we miss is the company of others, the great conversations, the hug. That's what life's all about. And I think it's given all of us and everyone a chance to reflect on what does matter. And to me, what has worked, as I said earlier, is this thing called social solidarity. You know, many of the agencies and government departments are kind of like battling to cope at the present time, because you can't do things like you normally do. Programs and services just can't be rolled out. And yet it's kind of like place-based groups and neighbours and local community groups who really are the ones that are the heroes in all of this, who have actually reached out and created new ways of connection. This morning I was out cycling. I have an e-bike riding group I've created for a group of old buggers like me. And we go out every Wednesday and Saturday morning cycling. And while we were having a break, an old friend, I hadn't seen her for about 4 years, turned up, and we started chatting. And she works for the federal government in the Department of Education and Employment. And she just made the most interesting thing. She said, you know, Peter, that thing called community that you keep talking about, can I just say it has actually been the place-based groups that have coped with all of this. She said, we fund a huge number of providers of services, but most of our private and our large girls and boy type organisations just aren't coping. But it's the place-based groups that have been adaptive, the ones that have actually seen you can't do things like you used to, and have been able to do that. And to me, there's something in all of that that I am really intent on making sure we keep. What has worked is community. And it seems to me that's one of the messages that I want to contribute to getting out, that as we move into this post-COVID-19 time, we've got to really say to people, you know, the answer to any issue is this thing called kind of like community and how we do it. I think we've also got to recognise that this has been an incredibly challenging time. We know the health implications, but I think the one aspect that we still have to get our heads around is also the mental health implications. I saw modelling today. My background is in the whole area of employment. And so as a former director of employment, I'm always interested in looking at stuff in that area. And it's interesting to see that the modelling, that if we actually currently, I know here in WA, we're sitting on about 11% unemployment rate. That's kind of like doubled in the last month. We could be moving towards 15%. And the modelling, certainly from people caught up in the mental health area, is that we could actually expect on figures like that, probably a 50% growth in the suicide rate based on previous crises at this time. And so for me, that in this country, we're talking about 1,500 more people who are likely to choose suicide as a form of ending their life. And again, there are implications there. It's interesting to see that this COVID-19 monitor that the ABC has introduced here has shown that people reporting on poor mental health, it's a thing that's run particularly through Monash University. The number of people have actually doubled in the month of March, while the number of people experiencing loneliness impaired tripled, and those feeling confusion multiplied 5 times. Again, the one thing that they say is working is the number of people, and that's been a growth, a triple rate, who've actually appreciated the new sense of social solidarity that's actually happened within their street or within their neighbourhood. So again, not all bad, but you know what, there's some really challenging times there. And as I said, particularly what I'm really concerned about is the implications it's having in terms of people's work and employment life, and particularly the number of people that have really had to cope with this in a very rapid way, in a way that no other crisis has ever created. And as I said, you know, 2/3 of people lost and learnt about losing their jobs with 0 or 1 day's notice. And when we think of the sheer numbers involved and the implications of that for people, is really, really interesting. And I suppose for me, it's got me thinking about the whole issue of what is community kind of like all about, and how well were we doing prior to COVID-19? And I think the one thing that I particularly want to say is, you know what, prior to COVID-19, we weren't really doing well then. So, you know, the type of community development systems that we've evolved, particularly from the 1960s onwards, where we've increasingly professionalised services, where we've particularly focused on servicing people rather than strengthening community, where we're particularly professionalised, where we've allowed levels of volunteerism to kind of like collapse. And in many ways, we've reduced citizenship by kind of like this professional type services. And the result is, well, I don't think we've got that healthier community to show for it. One of the things I love following is these omnipolls, which particularly people like Andrew Lee have kind of like undertaken. And the reality is that today in our country, in Australia, people have 4 less close friends than they had in the mid-80s. And in fact, close to 20% of people in the latest poll indicated that they have no one to turn to in terms of difficulty. Now, you know, to me, those statistics are kind of like horrifying, and they are an indication of the type of societal life that we've actually created in terms of it. For those of you who are not familiar with this poll, if you just have a look when it did start in 1984, fundamentally just asking simple questions about people's connection to neighbour and to friends. And if you even have just a look at those 4 questions that are popped up there, the reality is that we are not doing well, and we haven't been doing well, and we've been declining. And I suppose to me, the reality is we're now hit with this thing called COVID-19, and people have suddenly realised the importance of connection. Now, if that's the product of the type of community development practices that we've allowed to evolve across our countries, you know, I think there's a time to rethink where we're actually at with some of these stuff. Prior to COVID-19, back there in October, December, the ABC did this Australian Talks National Survey. 54,000 people talked about what keeps them awake at night, what is it they particularly care about. And again, if you have a look at some of those results, that really raised the whole issue that loneliness is probably the most critical kind of like issue that we actually face as a society. And so I'm really interested in terms of this time is giving us a time to rethink how we do things. It's given us a chance to demonstrate that the one thing that has actually worked as a society has been this thing called community. How are we going to actually kind of like move forward in terms of that? And I love kind of like popping up that quotation from Dave Hollis, who I think really challenges all. In the rush to return to normal, use this time to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to. And for me, it's about really questioning what I call the CD bit of ABCD. I think we do well on the asset-based stuff, but the citizen-driven bit, the community-driven bit that kind of like we've attached, I think we're probably not performing as well in that area. And that, to me, is what I want to kind of like see some change about, and particularly begin to challenge people about what is meaningful community building actually all about. I'm heartened, and those of you from the UK, I don't know whether you were amused, but when your Prime Minister wandered out of his near-death kind of like experience, he came out with that retake of the famous Maggie Thatcher's quote when he said, "There really is such a thing as society," which was the line which was a direct contradiction to that very famous statement when Maggie Thatcher said, "There's no such thing as society, there is only individuals and families." And I thought, you know, if here's a guy who through his own experience has suddenly woken up, you know what, this thing called society or community really matters. And again, it's interesting as I talk to a lot of people in local government, mayors and CEOs, there's suddenly a realization that this thing called kind of like community actually does work and can actually activate itself in interesting ways. And so in every crisis, there is danger, but also there is opportunity. And I think this is a time for all of us to kind of like think about those words of Einstein about let's not pretend that things will change if we keep doing the same things. This is a time to say, post-COVID-19, we really do want to see kind of like change in how we actually organise society and community. And to me, that is what we need to attack. That is what we need to begin to see is not worked. It's what we've basically implemented since the 1960s and 70s, is a model where this thing we call community development is fundamentally it's top down, it's outside in, always starts with a conversation about weaknesses, deficiencies, needs and disabilities in either community or people. We always then think that the answer to that particular scenario is we need more services and programs. And we have evolved this incredible new language. So the health department now refer to people as consumers of their services. NGOs love using this word called clients, which, let me say, comes from a Greek word meaning I'm lying on my back helpless and I need someone to help me stand up. Local governments now have customer service centres, and we no longer have residents in community, we have customers in community. And the one I really hate is that word service users. But I think all that language illustrates a model of community development that I think we need to kind of like begin to question. Now, to deliver that model, we obviously need silo provision. We need to kind of like continue this focusing on servicing community, and that whole model requires a whole pile of people, perhaps like ourselves, trained professionals who kind of like do it. And to me, that model, which I think is dominates the so-called community development sphere at the present time, needs to be kind of like questioned in many, many ways. We need to get rid of those labels. We need to begin to emphasize that people need to be a co-producer, a co-owner. In fact, we've got to rebirth this thing called citizenship in terms of where we're actually at. And we've got to begin to create and open doors and windows where people genuinely become kind of like true contributors in the whole thing. And so those of us who've subscribed to an ABCD kind of like model have always said that, look, there is two paths and there are two solutions. And we've always kind of like been attacking the stuff on the left and so on. It seems to me it's the stuff on the right that we need to kind of like begin to highlight. And yes, I think we've done really well in getting people thinking about strengths and strength-based approaches and whatever. but it's that issue of citizenship. How do we actually begin to get people realizing that at the end of the day, communities have got to build from inside out, and we've got to engage local people in terms of where it's actually at in a very real and kind of like meaningful way. I particularly find Cormac Russell's interesting little scenario where he's basically saying, you know what, we know how to do this 2 and 4 people really well. We play around with this thing called with, and particularly lots of local governments are now into engagement, but that's usually about saying to people, we got 3 options. One's pink, one's yellow, and one's purple. Which do you want? And we call that community engagement. No, that's called tell us your priorities. We need to improve the with bit. But above all, I suppose what I'm wanting to see is how do we begin to create a lot more space, open doors and windows of and by the people. And it seems to me that it's that quadrant that we are not doing well in at all generally, and nor are the resources committed to that, nor are government programs or services even, I think, understanding what that's actually all about. And to me, the fundamental reality is that we have fundamentally outsourced citizenship, and we've done it in the name of community development. And I think it's a time now to kind of like say, you know what's worked during COVID-19 has been the social solidarity, neighbour helping neighbour, getting people kind of like connected. Many of you know that I'm passionate about Aussie rules footy and passionate about my team, which does not do too well, the Freo Dockers. And I love to use that analogy that whenever I'm sitting in the stadium there with my young daughter, Ali, and we're watching our team yet again get thrashed, I love to kind of like turn to her and say, look, Al, we didn't lose again today. We just ran out of time. But also to say, you know what, sitting here today reminds me of the model that we've accepted in terms of community development. And it's probably the best analogy I know, and I know some of you have heard me quote it on numerous occasions, but it's really the equivalent to an Australian rules footy game where 30,000 people turn up who need the exercise to watch 36 players who don't. And while we continue that model of community development generally, and that's where all the resources are allocated, I don't believe we are systematically bringing about the changes that we want. In fact, I think it's contributing to kind of like the breakdown in terms of community and particularly people's disassociation kind of like from each other. I think we are challenged by those wonderful words from the 6th century China, go to the people, live among them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have, but are the best leaders when the task is done, the people remark, we've done it ourselves. And I think all of us subscribe to that. But that isn't the reality of what I actually see. And one of my friends in Adelaide put it much better when I think this is the modern equivalent. Go to the people in the gender, find out what's wrong with them, tell them what to do, enable and fix them, start with what they don't know, tell them what you think they should know. But are the worst leaders, when the program is done, the people remark, what have they done to us? And it just seems to me we have a choice. And fundamentally, I think I'm still seeing far too much of this. And I think COVID-19 has given us a wonderful time to stand up and say, let's begin to focus on what has actually kind of like worked. I think it's going back to the roots of all of this in terms of ABCD. And I love reflecting on the fact that this all did start in those 80s when Jody and John kind of like had that opportunity to crisscross America, basically sit down with a whole pile of neighborhoods and generate, 4,000 stories. But the start of that story was to say, tell us a time when you and your neighbors came together and made things better. And I think, again, the outcome of all of that was pretty powerful in terms of what they were able to evolve. And I think, to me, it is about getting back to recognizing that what they did share was a time when they decided to kind of like the fact that they felt empowered to hold hands with other neighbours and start using internally what they've got. But above all, to start driving the initiative from within, recognising this stuff is kind of like an inside job in terms of what's actually needed. And I suppose what I believe is important is that we do need to start replacing or saying, let's have less of what we see on the left and far more of what we actually see on the right. And I think it's about time that is where the energy and the priority and where the challenge needs to be in terms of where all the stuff's at. I think, again, Cormac has provided us, again, another interesting continuum in terms of where it's at, and it kind of like reinforces that. But it seems to me it's the stuff on the right that works. It's the stuff on the left that is not just not working, it's actually contributing to breaking down community. And I think that we need to constantly just be pushing at this time that there is a new way, and that is where the emphasis needs to go. To me, there are two aspects that I think we've got to push. One is the strong citizen-driven component, and getting people to understand what that actually means in reality. How does that become real? And how do we actually begin to support that type of initiative? And the second, I think, is that thing that I particularly learned from Jody, that what I call that gift obsessiveness, that every single person has kind of like capacities and abilities and gifts, and living a good life depends whether those stuff are kind of like expressed in whatever. And it just seems to me, again, I'm interested in how we, again, begin to get people thinking about that in terms of where we're actually at and so on. You know, what I find amazing is that when we look at the World Health Organization's definition of mental health, it actually reinforces that. The fact that it is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her abilities and can cope with normal stresses, can work productively, but that last bit, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. That to me is what this thing called citizenship's about. And it seems to me in our rush to kind of like help people, we have really just created this whole industry that's there doing things to and for people. How do we begin to kind of like stand up against that? Again, I think Jody's words reinforce the fact that every living person has some gift or capacity or value, and that a strong community is a place that recognises this and ensures they're given. A weak community is a place where lots of people can't or don't give their gifts. And fundamentally, most of our communities have created a world where fundamentally they are a recipient, a spectator in what's actually going on within their community. We need to kind of like change that whole pendulum in the other direction. So again, going back to the words of Cormac, there is no two-tiered society with one group with all the problems or rescued by another group with all the solutions. There's only us. And I think that's the kind of like message that COVID-19 has actually given us a chance to demonstrate. Across the globe, incredible examples of how this thing called social solidarity, where people have stepped up, where people have demonstrated care and kindness and overcome the anxiety and the fear by kind of like reaching out over the kind of like the fence across the driveway and come up with the most amazing set of kind of like local driven kind of like solutions to where we're actually at. And it seems to me we've never been given such a better time to kind of like say, you know what, that's the way forward once we kind of like come outside of this tunnel called COVID-19. Here in Australia, we have this wonderful Aboriginal educator and activist, Lilia Watson, who put it very well: if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation's bound up with mine, then let's work together. And I think we've got to begin to take seriously this partnership that we really need. It's fundamental to the ABCD philosophy. And it just seems to me that I think we need to kind of like begin to kind of like focus on that a lot more. Quint Stutter is a guy who does a lot of work with rural communities in the US. And I just, again, love what he said. Don't expect the reboot to put your community right back where it was before COVID-19. For starters, it's not possible. I've read and heard this many times and I agree. When this is over, the world will have changed in many ways. But also, even if we could, we shouldn't settle for a return to the old norm. We owe it to the community to aim higher. And I suppose that's the appeal and the pitch that I really just want to throw out tonight. I think our communities deserve better than what we had prior to COVID-19. If there's a return back to what's known as community development that we knew prior, then I think a lot of this crisis is, you know, the value of it has actually been kind of like wasted in terms of where we're actually at. Can I just finish? As you know, I love quotes. Let me just throw in a couple of more and then throw it open to discussion. Again, that wonderful one of Amanda Abrams. In a world where the social fabric seems to be rapidly fraying, the economy is uncertain, and the future of the planet's at risk, is there a better time to hit the reset button than to come back to the neighbourhood level and begin to genuinely rely on one another again? And I think these are the type of messages that I just hope that I can, in a small way, can contribute to kind of like getting out to our politicians, to our policymakers, to our funders, to our so-called philanthropic people who have traditionally, I think, funded a model of community development that's actually broken community down. I hope we can get them to begin to see there is another way we need to kind of like move forward. Susan Rands, those of you who have been around for a long time in the ABCD Institute will know, I knew no one who had more multiple kind of like physical challenges in their life than Susan, but I always remember these words she once shared: our purpose is not to help people. And that's the first message we've got to get rid of. Our purpose is to build a different kind of community, kind of like for all of us. So that to me is what I'm fundamentally on about. It's fundamentally about saying we have now an opportunity like never before to say, you know what, let's look at what's worked and then let's move forward. And my favorite kind of like slide in terms of these times is this one. May that be kind of like the message to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
The sermon for the night.
Thanks, Peter. If you could stop sharing your screen or click